Hello, and thank you for watching. My name is Bradford Roberts, Principal Broker, Founder, and Owner of TR Realty in the Las Vegas area. After watching this video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. Download the pertinent handouts for this video by clicking the link in the comments below. Now let's get started. All right, let us move ahead to paragraph 2. There's quite a few things to talk about here, and some of them are incredibly dangerous for a real estate agent. So we need to cover these in great detail. Paragraph 2 says additional financial terms and contingencies. So 2A says new loan application. New loan application, meaning if you gave me anything in paragraph 1C, you must do 2A, okay? It says new loan application. Within blank business days of acceptance, buyer agrees to 1. Submit a completed loan application to a lender of buyer's choice, and 2. Furnish a pre-approval letter to seller based upon a standard factual credit report and review of debt-to-income ratios. So sometimes I see agents writing in here done or 0. I guess they haven't read the paragraph, because this doesn't just say furnish a pre-approval letter. It also says submit a loan application. And a loan application is specific to a property. A pre-approval letter is specific to a person. So we get a pre-approval letter saying that the buyer is pre-approved to buy X amount of value. However, it is still contingent upon the actual property itself. So this can never be done, as an example. We always need some number of days for the buyer to submit a loan application. And my recommendation here is 2 or 3 business days, not 2 to 3, meaning a range. We need an actual number in here, somewhere around 2 or 3. The paragraph goes on to say, if buyer fails to complete any of these conditions within the applicable time frame, seller reserves the right to terminate this agreement. In such event, both parties agree to cancel the escrow and return the EMD to the buyer. Buyer shall use buyer's best efforts to obtain financing under the terms and conditions outlined in this agreement. All right, so that is the new loan application paragraph, which must be used if you've indicated the buyer is getting a new loan in paragraph 1C. Let's move on to paragraph 2B. This is our appraisal contingency. And I often see agents trying to create some language in additional terms. Never, ever write language, okay? That is the worst thing you can do as an agent. The liability is off the charts for you, and of course, the potential for hurting your client is huge as well. So a lot of agents try to write language about appraisal contingencies because they haven't read this paragraph. So let's go through this together and make sure that my team understands how to use the appraisal contingency. It says here, the buyer's obligation to purchase the property is contingent upon the property appraising for not less than the purchase price, period. It's contingent upon the property appraising for not less than the purchase price. You might know that lenders will lend based on the appraised value or the contract price, whichever is lower. So there's a lot of problems with appraisals, especially when the market is appreciating in price. We often see a situation where the buyer and seller effectuate a contract for some amount of money, but then later the appraiser goes out and says the property is not quite worth that, it's worth some number less than that. And when the appraisal comes in for less than the contract price, there's actually 4 scenarios that can ensue. One scenario is the buyer, if he has the ability, can come up with the difference between the appraised value and the contract price in cash, make it part of his down payment. The second thing that can happen is the seller, if he's willing, can actually reduce the contract price to match the appraisal. The third scenario is that the parties can do a combination of those two and meet somewhere in the middle. Or the fourth possible scenario is the cancellation of the contract. That doesn't work for anyone, right? But those are the 4 things that can happen. And the paragraph goes on to say, if after the completion of an appraisal by a licensed appraiser, buyer receives written notice from the lender or the appraiser that the property is appraised for less than the purchase price, and that is referred to as a notice of appraised value, buyer may attempt to renegotiate or cancel the RPA by providing written notice to the seller along with a copy of the appraisal, no later than blank calendar days following the date of acceptance of the RPA, whereupon the EMD shall be released to the buyer without the requirement of written authorization from the seller. So that is addressing the scenarios that I discussed with you a moment ago. And on line 14, we need to fill in some number of days that protect the buyer in case that appraisal comes low. So I want to give you my recommendation here. If your buyer is getting a conventional loan or an FHA loan, my recommendation is 21 days. If your buyer is getting a VA loan, my recommendation is 25 days. But there's a caveat to any of my recommendations. I can't speak for the lender. There might be unusual circumstances with your buyer. Who knows what could be happening between the buyer and the lender? So you probably want to check with the lender to see if the number of days that I'm advising here would work in that specific case. But having talked to several lenders, I know in the vast majority of cases, if we give this 21-day for conventional RFHA, 25-day for VA time frame, I know that in almost every scenario, those numbers are going to work. So that is the number of days during which the loan application must be submitted, the appraisal must be ordered, then performed, and then the appraisal report actually received so that the buyer can choose to exercise this paragraph, this appraisal contingency. And I get contacted, unfortunately, I get contacted by agents all the time who say to me, my appraisal contingency is about to expire, but the appraisal has not been performed, or we haven't heard about the appraisal yet. Well, you've got to watch the number of days here very carefully. If the number of days that we indicate here pass, and you have not yet received the appraisal report, you got a problem. Because now if the property appraises low, the buyer is in the situation where either he has to come up with the difference or his EMD could be completely forfeit. So we don't want that deadline to come without dealing with that appraisal report. So you can see this is very, very dangerous for real estate agents. If the real estate agent is not paying attention or doesn't understand this paragraph, he could easily let this time frame pass, and then after which the appraisal comes in low, he puts the buyer in a terrible situation. Please don't let that happen. And the structure for paragraph 2C is very similar, but this time it's not about the appraisal contingency, it's about the loan contingency. It says buyer's obligation to purchase the property is contingent upon buyer obtaining the loan referenced in section 1C or 1D of the RPA unless otherwise agreed in writing. Buyer shall remove the loan contingency in writing, attempt to renegotiate or cancel the RPA by providing written notice to the seller no later than blank calendar days following the date of acceptance, and the language is the same as 2B. 2C can never be shorter than 2B. We can't have a loan contingency expire before we even know the results of the appraisal. So 2C always needs to match or exceed the time frame that we put in 2B. Let me give you my recommendations here. If your buyer is getting conventional financing or an FHA loan, my recommendation is 30 days. And if your buyer is attempting to obtain VA financing, my recommendation here is 35 days. And again, same caveat, check with the lender. Folks, we can't just throw some arbitrary number of days in the appraisal contingency and the loan contingency and then put pressure on the lender to perform. I saw one literally a few days ago. This was written by a buyer's agent at another company. Thankfully, this guy was not my agent. But he wrote an appraisal contingency and a loan contingency of 2 days each. Tell me how that's going to work. That when we effectuate a contract, the buyer is going to submit a loan application to the lender's going to contact an appraiser, the appraiser may be busy, he's got a schedule to go out to the property, he's got to do his comps, he's got to draft his report, submit it back to the lender, who submits it back to the buyer, who then has to respond. This is all going to happen in 2 days? It's ridiculous. That agent is putting his buyer in a terrible, terrible situation. So please follow carefully the recommended number of days that I've given you for 2B or 2C. Should you fail to put a proper amount of time, should you fail to pay attention to the time, you are putting your buyer in an incredibly risky situation. Don't do it. Rewind this video if you need to so you understand 2B and 2C, but these paragraphs are incredibly important. And let's take a look at paragraph 2D, which is used in the event of a cash purchase. It says, within some business days of acceptance, buyer agrees to provide written evidence from a bona fide financial institution of sufficient cash available to complete this purchase. Let's take a look at that. We need to indicate a number of days if this is a cash purchase. So, if paragraph 1C, 1D, and 1E are all blank, that is the only time you can use paragraph 2D. And you could never use 2D and 2A at the same time. That wouldn't make any sense either. I wish they had ors in here, but they don't. So we need a number of days, and my recommendation here is somewhere around 2 or 3 days. Now, if your buyer has already provided some verification of funds, this is a chance you could put done if you wanted to. But my recommendation is not to do that, to put 2 or 3 days. And then it says in this paragraph, from a bona fide, which is a Latin phrase meaning genuine, financial institution. Where does it say a U.S. institution? I've heard a lot of agents say, oh, well, the bank is in Canada, the bank is in Mexico, the bank is in Russia. It doesn't matter. If it's a bona fide financial institution and we can provide proof of the funds, that is good enough. It does not have to be in U.S. dollars or in a U.S. bank. So, folks, that is paragraph 2. I hope it is very, very clear to you at this point because I'm about to move on to paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 says sale of other property. Sale of other property. They're not talking about this property at all. Paragraph 3 is a contingency paragraph, meaning I'll buy your house if I could sell mine first. So sale of other property. And depending on market conditions, this paragraph might be completely ignored. Because if you're in a seller's market, writing an offer contingent upon selling some other property is incredibly weak and highly unlikely to be chosen. Who wants to tie up their house based on some other transaction over which they have no control? So this is a paragraph that is generally only used in a weak market, a buyer's market. It says on line 30, this agreement is not contingent upon the sale of any property owned by the buyer, or if this box is checked, the attached contingent upon sale addendum is hereby incorporated into this agreement. So if you do nothing with paragraph 3, there is no such contingency. If you are writing an offer contingent upon the sale of some other property, then what you want to do is go to line 31, check the box, and that the contingent upon sale addendum is a real form that you can find in Transaction Desk. And if you're going to check that box on line 31 and you're going to use that addendum, you're going to go to paragraph 27. You're going to write in the name of that addendum, contingent upon sale addendum, and then, of course, you're going to attach that and make it part of this offer. All right, let us move ahead to paragraph 4. And paragraph 4 talks about fixtures and personal property. Now, you might have heard me say in a different video that personal property is often the source of dispute between the buyer and seller. We know by definition, real property is things that are attached. Personal property is things that are not attached. What we don't know is how to really define the word attached, because I've seen different courts interpret the word attached in different ways. So therefore, if we know in advance that something could be the source of a dispute or a misinterpretation, it would be recommended that we pay very careful attention to detail and make sure that we itemize very carefully in paragraph 4 any items that are personal property or could even be perceived as personal property that are going to be included or excluded from the sale. Paragraph 4 says, the following items will be transferred free of liens with the sale of the property with no real value unless stated otherwise herein. I want to bring your attention to the phrase no real value. So when we write an offer to buy, we wouldn't want to say something like the living room furniture with a value of $2,000 shall remain on the property. We don't want to assign a value to personal property. There's two reasons why we don't want to do that. One is the lender is only going to lend on the real property. So if the lender sees that we have evaluated a living room set at $2,000 and that living room set is included in the sale, the lender is actually going to deduct that $2,000 from the amount of the mortgage. And the second reason we say no real value is because under Nevada law, if we included a $2,000 living room set, that $2,000 becomes sales taxable. So we leave things for no real value. There's a cost to the seller to remove them. There's a cost to the buyer to replace them. So these things are left at a convenience of the parties with no real value. It says, unless an item is covered under Section 7F of this agreement, all items are transferred in an as-is condition. Notice the capital letters about to come. All existing fixtures and fittings, including but not limited to electrical, mechanical, lighting, plumbing, and heating fixtures, ceiling fans, etc., etc. The reason the word existing is capitalized is because a lot of sellers feel if they bought the property and something didn't exist, but they added it later, that they have the right to take it. That is not the case. Let's say a seller bought a house that didn't have any ceiling fans, and then the seller decided to install some ceiling fans. Once he installed them, he attached them to real property. They became real property, and unless specified differently in the contract, those are existing fixtures, and there would be an expectation that those ceiling fans would convey to the buyer. So we have to be very, very careful here, starting on line 42 and going all the way to 44. We can put anything here for purposes of clarification, even if we kind of sort of maybe think it's real property, we kind of sort of maybe think it's attached. Let's be clear. Let's get it in here just to be safe so the parties don't have an argument. Things like tool sheds. Sometimes you can't tell, is the tool shed tied down to a foundation or is it just sitting on the foundation? Things like an above ground swimming pool, things like appliances, often disputed in a transaction. So let's be smart, let's be savvy, and let's itemize these things very carefully. I see a lot of agents doing a stupid, sloppy, lazy thing in this paragraph. And that is they will write, as per MLS. I don't want you to do that. The only way you might be able to get away with that is if you said, as per MLS, at a certain day and a certain time, you went to paragraph 27, you indicated the MLS report as an addendum to the contract, and then you actually attach the MLS page, the MLS report, to this RPA. Short of jumping through all of those hoops, don't say as per MLS. It's the listing agent who went into MLS and entered those things in the first place. It's the listing agent who can go in tomorrow and change those things. So don't do that. Be careful, be diligent, and actually itemize everything in paragraph 4. Oh, and actually, before I start paragraph 5, there is one more thing I want to mention about paragraph 4. I did tell you that there's often disputes between buyers and sellers. I want to mention that the law of fixtures does favor the buyers, typically in Nevada courts. So if there were a dispute over something that one party thought was personal property, the other party thought might be real property, typically the courts have been slanting in favor of the buyers to get whatever item that they were disputing. Just FYI on that. Okay, let us move ahead to paragraph 5 now, which is our escrow paragraph. Beginning with paragraph and section 5A on line 47. Please follow along with me here. Opening of escrow. The purchase of the property shall be consummated through escrow. Opening of escrow shall take place by the end of 1 business day after acceptance of this agreement at, and on line 49, we need to write in the name of a title company. As many of you know, I am extremely partial to Driggs Title Agency. Driggs, D-R-I-G-G''S. Definitely my favorite title company in Nevada. And then it says with, and on line 50, we actually write in the name of an escrow officer. I am very partial to Kyle Wallace. Not only is Kyle Wallace an incredible escrow officer, but he is an attorney. So he, being an attorney, can really improve the oversight and the problem solving that invariably arises in a transaction. So I believe this is definitely worth fighting for or negotiating in your transaction. I think using Kyle Wallace at Driggs Title is a huge benefit to everyone, the agents, the brokers, but also the buyer and the seller as well. So I recommend that. But in any case, we need to write in the name of a title company on 49, the name of an escrow officer on 50. I don't want to see TBD or anything like that. TBD, to be determined, forget it. We don't want to use that. We also don't want to see the words seller's choice. If you're willing to acquiesce to the seller's choice of a title company, that's fine, but find out who it is. They actually need to be in here. The last time I checked, seller's choice was not the name of a title company, and this is asking you for the name of a title company, so we need to get that in here. And it says, or such other escrow officer as escrow company may assign. Opening of escrow shall occur upon escrow company's receipt of this fully accepted agreement. Escrow holder is instructed to notify the parties through their respective agents of the opening date and escrow number. All right, let's go to 5B, which talks about earnest money. And you're going to see now in this paragraph how we actually circle back to something that I mentioned in paragraph 1. It says, upon acceptance, buyer's EMD, as shown in section 1A and 1B, if applicable, of this agreement, shall be deposited pursuant to the language in section 1A and 1B, if applicable. So 1A, go ahead and flip back to paragraph 1, page 1, is your EMD, right? Why 1B, if applicable? It's because of that choice we make in paragraph 1B, where we indicate that an additional deposit will or will not be considered part of the EMD. So that's why it says if applicable. Moving on to 5C, there is our close of escrow date. Close of escrow shall be on or before. Look at the language that is pre-printed in this form. On or before. An older version of this RPA used to say on. And what would happen sometimes is some lenders or some title companies would actually require an addendum changing the closing date, even if both parties wanted to close early. So that's why this one says on or before, meaning that our close of escrow date is our drop dead date. And if the parties mutually consent to an earlier closing, we don't need an addendum. We can go ahead and close early. And on line 3, we put an incredibly important date. I want to address this in some detail. This date really, really matters. Real estate agents are overly ambitious. I guess another way of saying that is they want to get paid, so they put a tight closing date. Folks, if you put a closing date that is not going to work, it needs to be extended, it's just not realistic, you're putting your buyer in a situation where he's got to go back to the seller with his hand out, begging for an extension. And you're putting the buyer in a situation where when he begs for an extension, he's at the mercy of the seller. The seller can say, no, I'm not giving you extra time. And what happens in that case? The buyer can't perform by the closing date, wave goodbye to the earnest money deposit, and wave hello to the possibility of litigation. We don't want that. The buyer would lose the house, lose the money, and possibly subject himself to some legal action. We don't want that. Here's another thing to keep in mind with the closing date that we put here in paragraph 5C that agents don't seem to understand. When you write an offer and you submit the offer, it is extremely rare that you're going to write it, submit it, the seller's going to accept it the same day, no counteroffer back to the buyer, that we're wrapped up the same day. Typically, folks, this process takes days. Sometimes it can take a week or longer. Typically, the seller will counteroffer, and typically he won't counteroffer until just before your offer is set to expire. So it could be a day or two, and then he submits a counteroffer. And now the buyer needs to think about that for a day or two, and back and forth and back and forth. And guess what's happening to your calendar? So another way of saying that is when you put a closing date in your RPA, you have to account for that negotiation and counteroffer period of time. If you talk to a lender and the lender says, I can close in 30 days, and you write an offer today that says 30-day closing date, it's ridiculous. You're not going to get an effective contract today 99.9% of the time. So you have to pad the closing date. You know, if you close early, you're a hero. If you close late, you're a dog, you're a loser. So always pad the time. There's another thing to think about here. The seller, if he is approached by the buyer and the buyer is asking the seller for more time, he can completely abuse the buyer. I literally had one minutes before filming this video today, where one of my associates came to me and said, here's the situation. The lender needs more time. And the buyer went back to the seller, and the seller said, I want a per diem. A per diem is a Latin phrase meaning by the day, and what it refers to is the buyer paying the seller a penalty. Well, you might think the seller is greedy or something like that, but folks, there's cost to carry a house. Every day a seller is carrying a house, he's paying maybe an association fee, taxes, insurance, utilities, mortgage, interest, of course, right? It could be, landscaping costs and other things that are going on the property. Don't forget, there's a gas bill and an alarm system and other things that cost money every day. So don't be surprised. If you put a tight closing date, you go to the seller, you ask for more time. Don't be surprised when the seller says, okay, it's going to cost you X amount of money, or I want to go hard on the EMD, or no, I'm not going to give you an extension at all. So be smart. Give your buyer plenty of time to close. And I want to give you my recommendation here for closing time. If your buyer is paying cash and there's no common interest community, meaning no resale package, you could close in as little as 3 days, depending on what the parties want to do. If your buyer is cash, but there is a common interest community, so we need to order that resale package, my recommendation is to go at least 14 days out. If your buyer is conventional, my recommendation here is 40 days. And if your buyer is getting an FHA or a VA loan product, my recommendation is 50 days. Now, I know some of you watching this video right now are saying, whoa, 40 days on a conventional, 50 days on an FHA or a VA, that's a long time. If you think that, you didn't hear me. I said the closing date needs to include that back and forth time, that counteroffer period that could go many days, a week, or even more. Be smart. Pad the closing date, close early, and everybody will love you. I also recommend, by the way, when we pick a closing date on line 3, that we avoid the very first and the very last business days of the month. Those are the 2 days that the title company is busiest, and your file could end up getting bumped. That's not going to happen to you at Driggs, but your file could get bumped. What if you're closing on a Friday and they can't get to you because, let's be honest, real estate agents go out there and they write the name of a title company, they write a closing date. They never inquire with the title company, hey, do you think you can actually accommodate us on that day? They don't know who's out sick, who's on maternity leave, who's on vacation. They don't know what's going on at the title company. They just put a date, put a company, and then they expect the title company to perform. Well, what if 700 real estate agents were all closing a transaction on the same day at the same title company? Do you think the title company could handle all those files in one day? It's not going to happen, right? So they're going to bump to the next business day. And if you're closing on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday before we can close. I won't even talk about a holiday weekend. So I recommend we avoid the first and last business days of the month. I also recommend that we avoid the business day that precedes or follows a national holiday. You can imagine in the case of a national holiday that there's a lot of people who don't go to work. So the staff is short and it's difficult to close those files. So that is how we do paragraph 5. All right, let's take a look at paragraph 6, which is the title insurance. It says this purchase agreement is contingent upon the seller's ability to deliver good and marketable title as evidenced by a policy of title insurance naming the buyer as the insured in an amount equal to the purchase price, furnished by the title company identified in section 5A. Said policy shall be in the form necessary to effectuate marketable title or its equivalent and shall be paid for as set forth in section 8A, which we've yet to come to, of course. So this paragraph is talking about the title insurance that we refer to as the owner's policy or seller's policy, despite the name actually protects the incoming buyer for the property. And as you can see in this paragraph, it says the purchase agreement is contingent upon that. So if for some reason the seller was unable to deliver clear title, that would invalidate this purchase and sale agreement because of the unfulfilled contingency, and the buyer's EMD would be refunded. Let us move on to paragraph 7, which is also an incredibly powerful but dangerous paragraph for the real estate agent. So let's make sure that we get this paragraph covered in great detail. So I'm starting on line 16 now, paragraph 7. Buyer's obligation is or is not conditioned on the buyer's due diligence defined in section 7A below. Is, always is. We would not want to waive the due diligence contingency. That would be pretty foolish in my opinion. So we're always going to check where it says is. And then it says this condition is referred to as a due diligence condition. If checked in the affirmative, section 7A through C shall apply. Otherwise, they do not. So we want those things to apply. Buyer shall have some calendar days following the date of acceptance of the RPA as defined in Section 23 herein to complete buyer's due diligence. So I stress the word following because the date of acceptance, the date of effectuation as I like to call it, does not apply. So if we have today as the effective date, today is not day one. Tomorrow is day one. So that's why they use the word following the date of acceptance. And we need to indicate a number here in line 18. My recommendation is somewhere between 12 and 15 days. I know that traditionally we've always done 10 days, but with the newer versions of this RPA, there are some reasons that I'm recommending a slightly longer due diligence period. So my recommendation is to put in here 12 or somewhere up to 15 calendar days. If you put longer than that, it's probably going to be a turnoff to the seller. If you put shorter than that, it is now becoming a little bit restrictive and tight for the buyer. It goes on to say, seller agrees to cooperate with buyer's due diligence. Seller shall ensure that all necessary utilities are on for buyer's investigations, that means his inspections, and through the close of escrow. So I also see agents trying to write some language about utilities. Stop it. You don't need to do it. It's right here. It clearly says the utilities need to be on. However, I want to bring something incredibly important to your attention. Those of you practicing real estate since before 2016, you might remember when this due diligence paragraph was different, when it was constructed differently. What it used to say was that the due diligence period would be automatically extended by the same number of days that the utilities were not on. That's gone. And as a result, folks, your due diligence period now is hard. Now, the parties can agree, mutual consent, they both have to agree to extend the due diligence. But the only way the parties can extend the due diligence is by mutual consent before the due diligence period ends. You can't let the due diligence period expire and then try to extend it. That will not work. You're putting your buyer in a really bad situation. So the burden is on the buyer to resolve, not just to raise an issue, but to resolve the issue during the due diligence period, or cancellation is the only option. And then that brings me to a discussion of unilateral versus bilateral cancellation. The due diligence period is a perfect example of a unilateral cancellation. Of course, unilateral meaning one-sided. A unilateral right of cancellation would mean that one party, in this case the buyer, all they have to do to cancel is to send that written notice of cancellation to the other side. That's it. That due diligence period is a unilateral right of cancellation. And there are other unilateral rights of cancellation. In fact, some that we've already talked about so far in this video. We've talked about, as an example, the appraisal contingency. We've talked about the loan contingency. Those are unilateral, meaning if the buyer is coming up against those deadlines and they feel they're not able to perform, they can go ahead and send that cancellation. They do not need the seller to consent to the cancellation. However, there are other provisions of this contract that would require bilateral cancellation, meaning two-sided. The parties have to agree. I get this question all the time. My buyer during the due diligence period wanted to cancel, but the seller doesn't agree. How do we handle this? Well, folks, due diligence is a unilateral right of cancellation. The seller doesn't have to agree, okay? So I want to make sure that we understand unilateral versus bilateral cancellation. Let us move on to paragraph 7A, property inspection and condition. During the due diligence period, buyer shall take such action as buyer deems necessary to determine whether the property is satisfactory to buyer, including but not limited to whether the property is insurable to buyer's satisfaction, whether there are unsatisfactory conditions surrounding or otherwise affecting the property, such as location of flood zones, airport noise, noxious fumes or odors, environmental substances or hazards, whether the property is properly zoned, locality to freeways, railroads, places of worship, schools, golf courses, on and on. I want to bring your attention back to line 25, the phrase, whether property is insurable. So as of now, there is no insurance contingency in our contract. I predict in my lifetime we will see that. Now, right now, we have many, many ways out of the contract, especially if we're the buyer. Insurance is not one of them. And for those of you who have watched my video series, Class 2, where I talk about insurance, I say in that video that insurance should be considered a due diligence item because there are no other ways out of the contract if you don't like the coverage or the cost of that coverage. So here it is. The words are here. Whether property is insurable becomes part of the due diligence period. I want to bring your attention now back to line 28. It says, during such period, buyer shall have the right to conduct non-invasive and non-destructive inspections. So yeah, we can't go into a seller's home and rip up the carpeting and poke holes in the wall to see what's in there and that sort of thing. So non-invasive and non-destructive. It continues to tell us what kinds of inspections we're allowed to do. Line 31, seller agrees to provide reasonable access to the property to buyer and buyer's inspectors. Buyer agrees to indemnify and hold seller harmless with respect to any injuries suffered by buyer or third parties present at buyer's request while on seller's property, etc., etc. I want to bring your attention down to line 39 now, at the very end of the line where it says, buyer shall provide seller at the time of cancellation with a copy of the report. So this is in the case of a buyer canceling because of the results of the inspection. The buyer would then provide that inspection to the seller. But in my opinion, that's a pretty silly thing because during the due diligence period, the buyer doesn't have to give a reason for cancellation. Again, it's unilateral. The buyer can say, the buyer can feel the property is perfect and I hate perfection, and therefore I want to cancel this purchase and sale agreement. He doesn't need to provide a reason. There's another thing I hear from agents all the time. My buyer is within his due diligence period. He wants to cancel, and the listing agent is demanding to know why. No, he doesn't have to know why. We don't have to tell him why. We don't have to provide any kind of reason. That's what unilateral means. Let's take a look at 7B. Buyer's right to cancel or resolve objections. Very important title. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion, right, unilateral, that the results of the due diligence period are unacceptable, buyer may either, 1, no later than the due diligence deadline referenced in Section 7, cancel the RPA by providing written notice to the seller, whereupon the EMD referenced in Section 1A shall be released to the buyer without the requirement of further written authorization from the seller. Or 2, no later than the due diligence deadline referenced in Section 7, resolve in writing with seller any objections buyer has arising from buyer's due diligence. Folks, the absolute word to stress is resolve. Again, those of you practicing real estate before 2016, you might remember how this was worded differently. And it said something like, due diligence will be automatically extended by the same number of days it takes the seller to respond to buyer's objections. Gone. That is gone. And now this deadline is hard. And I want to caution you, especially you rookie agents watching this video. Don't let a seller's agent, a listing agent, trick you. Don't let them run out your clock. This is another unfortunate message that I get from my associates way too often, where they say, during the due diligence period, my buyer asked the seller to do a repair, or my buyer had some concern, and we haven't heard back from the listing agent yet. Okay, do you see what they're doing? They're running out your clock. And again, the due diligence period is hard. So if you let the other agent, the listing agent, run out your clock, your buyer is screwed. Don't let that happen. That's why we're focusing on the word resolve. And I want to give you a little strategy. I might be a little aggressive when I practice real estate. Another way to say that is that I'm a very strong advocate for my client. So, if I had a buyer who had some objection, maybe a repair issue or who knows what the heck the buyer is objecting to, I would submit my request for repair or whatever objection, whatever I wanted the seller to do, I would submit that. And in the same email, I would attach a cancellation addendum. Trust me, the phone will ring if you follow that strategy. Because now you're creating a situation where you're taking control away from the other side. You're bringing control back to your own client. The message you're sending is, look, we have a concern. We want you to address it. But if you don't, here's my cancellation addendum. You pick. Okay? So I know that's a little aggressive, a little strong for some of you. But remember, we must protect our client. I believe deeply in client advocacy. A lot of agents will submit that objection and wait, and they're calling, they're leaving voicemails, they're texting, emailing, nobody's responding. Tick-tock, tick-tock, boom, the due diligence period is over, and now their buyer is in serious trouble. And that's why when we look at paragraph C, 7C, failure to cancel or resolve objections. Listen, failure to cancel or resolve objections. To me, that is a hint. It is a hint that really underscores and supports the strategy that I just shared with you of sending the objection and the cancellation at the same time. And paragraph C is so powerful here that you can see it requires on line 53 the buyer's initials, an extra reinforcement. Hey, this is what can happen to you if you're not careful. 7C says, if buyer fails to cancel the RPA or fails to resolve in writing with seller any objections buyer has arising from buyer's due diligence as provided in section 7, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the due diligence condition. Pause, rewind if you have to. Get the impact, the power, the liability, the danger of that phrase. Go back to the title on line 50, failure to cancel or resolve. Real estate agents watching this video, pay attention to that paragraph. That can really come back to bite you if you don't understand how it works. 7D is about inspections. Acceptance of this offer is subject to the following reserved right. The reserved right. A lot of agents don't understand that by indicating inspections in paragraph 7D does not mean that we are necessarily going to do those inspections, but we're going to reserve the right to do those inspections. Buyer may have the property inspected and select the licensed contractors, certified building inspectors, and or other qualified professionals who will inspect the property. And once again, it says seller will ensure that all necessary utilities are turned on and supplied to the property within 2 business days after acceptance of this agreement and to remain on until COE. It is strongly recommended that buyer retain licensed Nevada professionals to conduct inspections. If any inspection is not completed and requested repairs are not delivered to seller within the due diligence period, buyer is deemed to have waived the right to that inspection and seller's liability for the cost of all repairs that inspection would have reasonably identified had it been conducted. Then we come to, starting on line 8, a box. You can see the box. It says identify which party shall pay for the inspection noted below either, and then it gives you your 5 choices. So everything below needs to be filled in, either seller, buyer, 50-50, waived, or NA. Of course, there's a big difference between waived and NA. Waived means something exists, but you're choosing not to inspect it. NA means it doesn't exist. So you have to know the difference between waived and NA, and you have to be very, very careful here. And I want to remind you again, what you're putting in this box is the buyer's right to inspect. Doesn't mean he has to do it. So I'm going to give you my recommendations for all of these choices, and everything is negotiable. Everything is negotiable. So what I'm about to tell you is only what I recommend. Let's take a look at the energy audit. My recommendation here is to waive it. Now, I hate saying that because we are a green company. I live as green a lifestyle as I possibly can. I'm all about an energy audit. But I want to tell you that sellers don't like this because it takes a lot of time and a lot of work. They have to put together, typically they put together a year's worth of utility bills for every utility on the property. It's kind of a pain in the butt for the seller. So unfortunately, regrettably, my recommendation here, if you want to get your offer accepted, is to waive the energy audit. The next one is the home inspection. My recommendation is this goes to the buyer. Next one down is the termite or pest inspection. My recommendation is this goes to the buyer unless the buyer is getting a VA mortgage, in which case it must go to the seller. In the case of a VA mortgage, the seller is required by federal law to pay for a termite inspection. So buyer, unless it's a VA, then it goes to the seller. Next up is the roof inspection. My recommendation is to go to the buyer. Then we have a septic lid removal. Most of the time, you're selling properties that don't have septic. So that would be NA. If there is a septic system on the property as opposed to a sewer system, or sometimes in addition to a sewer system, my recommendation would be to go to the buyer. The next one down is the survey. Typically that's going to be waived unless the buyer is requesting a survey. It is extremely rare now that a lender of a residential property would require a survey. So often we're going to go ahead and waive that. The next column, we have fungal contaminant inspection. We are talking primarily about mold. My recommendation is this goes to the buyer. Folks, it would be incredibly foolish if you would waive this, or certainly it would be stupid to put NA. You have no idea. You haven't done an inspection. But if you put waived and the regular inspection uncovers mold, now you don't even have the right to send a mold inspector to the property to ascertain whether the mold is toxic or not, how far it's spread, the cost of remediation, that kind of thing. So this should go to the buyer. The mechanical inspection should go to the buyer. The pool and spa inspection should go to the buyer if there is a pool or a spa. We're not talking about a community pool. We're talking about one that we're actually selling here. And then we're talking about a soil inspection. Next, that should go to the buyer as well, unless it's a condo. There's no soil in a condo. I remember seeing one that was written by an agent at another company recently where it was a single family house and the buyer's agent wrote NA. They're selling a house, but somehow there's no soil on the property. I thought that was kind of interesting. So that's something that should go to the buyer. The septic pumping, very much like the septic lid removal, that would be NA 99% of the time. Unless there's a septic system, then it should go to the buyer. You've got a couple of places for other. Unless you write in what other is, leave them alone, leave them blank. Don't say other, don't tell me what other is, and then tell me who's going to pay for the inspection. That would be ridiculous. The third column, you've got well inspection quantity and well inspection quality. Those are two different inspections, by the way. The first tells us how much water is available. The second tells us if the water is potable, drinkable, good quality. Most of the time, these are going to be NA, unless there's a well on the property, in which case these inspections probably go to the buyer. Wood burning device or chimney inspection, we're talking primarily about a fireplace. Could be a stove as well, but typically fireplace, and that should go to the buyer. Septic inspection, just like the septic pumping and lid removal, typically NA, unless there is a system, then this would go to the buyer. And a structural inspection is the last one there. I recommend that goes to the buyer. So if you don't like my recommendations, that's all they are, recommendations, because all of these things are negotiable. Let's take a look at 7E, which is not something that, in my experience, a lot of real estate agents really understand. You're about to. 7E, certifications. In the event an inspection reveals areas of concern with the roof, septic system, well, wood burning device, chimney, or the possible presence of a fungal contaminant, buyer reserves the right to require a certification. If you don't know what a certification is, this is a document that is produced by an expert company in a specific practice. So let's say, as an example, we do a home inspection, and the home inspector discovers there are some dead termites up in the attic. How do we know that the termite problem has really been eliminated? We need a termite expert to get up there with their expert tools, their years of experience, hopefully, to tell us, there are dead termites here, but there's no live infestation of termites. And here is a certification to prove it. So a certification is a statement by a company that is specific to a certain thing, like a roof, like termites, like mold, as an example. And it says here, buyer reserves the right to have that certification. So I want to share a little strategy with you. When I do a request for repair, if I'm representing a buyer and I'm asking the seller to do a repair, now I'm not talking about something simple, like a squeaky sliding glass door as an example, but something of more severe consequence, like mold, like a hole in the roof, like radon gas, lead-based paint, asbestos, something of great significance, and something that I personally might not be able to see clearly or determine if this problem has been remediated. I would go ahead and request a certification as part of the request for repair. So example, if I'm asking my seller to remediate mold, do you think I want to show up at the walkthrough and just look at the wall and now the mold is gone and I feel good about that? Maybe the seller just painted over it, right? So I want a certification from a mold company to tell me that the problem was remediated professionally and correctly. So I love asking for a certification whenever I ask for a repair. In paragraph 7F, buyer's request for repairs, I just referenced that a moment ago. It says it is the buyer's responsibility to inspect the property sufficiently as to satisfy buyer's use. Buyer reserves the right to request repairs based upon the SRPD or items which materially affect value or use of the property revealed by an inspection, certification, or appraisal. Items of a general maintenance or cosmetic nature which do not materially affect value or use of the property, which existed at the time of acceptance and which are not expressly addressed in this agreement, are deemed accepted by the buyer, except as otherwise provided in this agreement. The brokers herein have no responsibility, thankfully, to assist in the payment of any repair, correction, or deferred maintenance on the property, which may have been revealed by the above inspections, agreed upon by the buyer and seller, or requested by one party. So, regardless, the buyer always reserves the right to request repairs. I would like to thank you for watching this video. I hope it was informative for you. If you are licensed with another brokerage in Southern Nevada and would like to talk with me, please text me or visit our website. See you next time.